Wow! Can you all hear me? You hear me at the back? Okay. I am incredibly excited to be standing here this morning and talking to you. It's not something I do very regularly, like talking to so many people. I spend most of my days just in solitude in my studio, so being in front of all these people is quite out of my comfort zone, but that is what growth is all about, right? So thank you, Creative Mornings Malmö, for inviting me to speak today, and happy birthday. I've been to a few Creative Mornings, and it's always really interesting and an enriching experience. Thank you, Tom, for hosting us in this great space. I've never been here, and when I walked in, I was so amazed. Like, wow, it's really such a beautiful space, and I can just imagine it's very good for creativity. Thank you all for coming. So, curiosity. A deceptively simple word. An aspect of our character that most often gets taken for granted. Perhaps we've grown so accustomed to it as simply being part of our human nature that we have that its significance has never really occurred to us. Or perhaps it has for you, but I know for me, I'm guilty of the first. And it's not that I've never acknowledged its presence or its importance in my life, but I've always been an exceptionally curious person. But I've always just sort of accepted it in the same way as I accepted the fact that I sometimes get hungry or sad or cold. I remember as a child lying in my bed, supposed to be sleeping, trying my utmost to be quiet, not even breathing, so that I can hear my parents' conversation going on in the kitchen. And when the conversation got really interesting, my curiosity would even drive me to get out of my bed and tiptoe down the hallway and stand quietly outside the door, trying to overhear a conversation that was not meant for my ears in the first place. And that is not the only eavesdropping scenario that I can recall. Nothing triggers my curiosity more than overhearing people or seeing people whispering or trying to do or say something unnoticed. I just have to know what they are saying or what they are trying to hide. If something is labeled as forbidden, it is as if they are literally asking me to ignore that label. Secrets do not stay secret for long around me. I am incredibly curious about people. The way that people act, the way that they behave, the way that they interact. And now I'm curious to know what makes you curious. I'm actually certain that it is exactly your curiosity that motivated you to get out of bed so early this morning and to brave the cold to make it here. So would you like to share a little with me, like what makes you curious? Is there anything in particular that really piques your curiosity?
Food experiences.
Food experience, oh good. To learn, taste new things, and,
traveling, new countries.
Aha. Anything else? Yes.
The future.
The future. Oh yeah, that's an interesting one. I think we're all curious to know about that. Yeah?
Or the things that I just don't understand.
Yeah, that's... If you don't get curious about that, then I don't know what. Yeah.
Well, you sparked my curiosity coming from South Africa all this way up in the cold north.
Well, I do live here.
Yes.
I didn't come all the way, especially for the talk.
No, I know that much.
Yeah,
But I'm just curious, what made you make that move?
Oh wow, thank you. Thank you. I feel very humbled. So I think it's obvious and evident that we are all curious beings by nature. And that curiosity is such an integral part of our human experience. And yet it wasn't until after I was invited to give this talk and I started to really think about and research this concept of curiosity that I came to recognize curiosity as being far more than a mere need to uncover a secret or to read the last page of a book first just to know how it ended. That's what I do. Yeah. I now acknowledge curiosity as the underpinning factor in shaping my character, the force that directs how I make sense of the world, the engine that fuels my learning, which in turn leads to professional and personal growth. And also, perhaps most importantly, it is my remedy for fear and frustration. And these are all concepts that I will be exploring throughout this talk. So being an obsessive researcher, in preparation for this talk, I started Googling, watching TED Talks, listening to podcasts, reading articles on the psychology and the neurology of curiosity, and to tell you the truth, I became quite overwhelmed with the wealth of information and research and studies done on this concept of curiosity. And although everything was very interesting and enlightening, I wanted to stay authentic. So today I won't be quoting any scientists or any educational psychologists, but instead I will be sharing with you 3 observations which surfaced while I was contemplating curiosity. And how curiosity relates to my life as a visual artist, and the role it plays in my creative journey. So my first observation is that curiosity is a remedy for fear. So research suggests that curiosity in the human brain is treated much like any other pleasurable activity, like eating. When we actively pursue new information, our brain is flooded with the pleasure-inducing the pleasure-inducing chemical called dopamine. So biologically speaking, we can say that our brains are literally wired to be curious. And let's just look at children for a moment. Is there anything more curious than a young child? I don't think so. Babies literally learn how the world works by being curious. They fiddle with everything, they stick things in their mouth, they shake it, they tug at everything, and I mean anyone who's ever had a baby or a toddler knows that nothing can be within reach of a 1-year-old because they will just like tear it apart. And that is because they are curious about it, and that is the way they learn about the world. Here's a fun fact. In a recent study that was done to determine the amount of questions that a child asks per day, they discovered that 4-year-old girls are the most curious, asking an incredible 390 questions a day, averaging 1 question every 1 minute 56 seconds. I have a 4-year-old girl at home. Enough said. Sorry, I have notes because I'm not really used to doing talks like this. So I have the privilege of often working with children in art workshops and at the church that I'm involved in. And it is this unstrained curiosity in them that really gives me so much pleasure working with them. I really find it inspiring how they marvel at new discoveries and how they need no or very little motivation to be creative. When a child is presented with a random collection of objects or art materials, they won't hesitate for even a second to start fiddling with them or playing, constructing, and experimenting with them. It is this uninhibited curiosity in them that I admire. And that is what fuels their creativity. But unfortunately, it is also a sad fact, and we don't need any study to convince anyone of this, that as we grow older, our curiosity dwindles. And having worked with children of all ages, I have found that a teenager needs a whole lot more encouragement to achieve the same level of creativity as a 5-year-old, for example. So if our brains are wired, it's built to be curious, and it's so innate to us as being humans, and we start off our lives in the state of curiosity bliss, why is it then that at some point we realize, somewhere along the line, our curiosity has taken a back seat to creativity and to education? One could argue that it should be at the very heart of it. And the answer came to me in one single word: fear. Children's curiosity, unfortunately, very often gets discouraged by systems and by social norms, because being curious might seem on the surface as a waste of time, or sometimes, I think most teachers can agree, an irritation. When there's one child in the classroom like fiddling with stuff and experimenting, and you have your plan, it's quite irritating, unfortunately. But yeah, one could say that this curiosity is amounting to nothing. But let's just take a moment to imagine what possibilities we would open ourselves up to if we changed the lens that we use to filter this world, not through fear, but through curiosity instead. What type of adults would we release into society if we raise our children to be curious without the fear of reprimand or judgment? And let's take a moment to imagine the type of people we would be if we allowed ourselves to be curious. In today's rush society, we grant ourselves so little grace to do things that seems like a waste of time. To indulge ourselves in activities that would merely satisfy our curiosity, because that would not be productive. I don't know about you, but I feel pressurized, and I don't really know by whom or by what, but to spend every moment of my day being productive. So when I spend 3 hours researching headless portrait photography from the Victorian era, I don't think anyone would consider that to be productive. I don't know about... oh yeah, be productive. But what would happen when I let myself go down that rabbit hole? I argue that it would result in a classic example of where curiosity ignites creativity. If I let fear restrain me, I risk not being optimally creative and potentially losing out on a breakthrough. I presume you are all in creative fields, or at least you aspire to live a creative life. Well, I'm of the opinion that it is only by living a fearlessly curious life that we can live an abundantly creative life. Indeed, we risk failure when we venture down this path that curiosity leads us on. And one could look at curiosity as the urge that draws us out of our comfort zones, and fear as the agent that keeps us within its boundaries. But it is when we take that risk to venture out of this comfort zone that great things happen. So this is a particular work that I completed a few months ago that was that I see as a personal breakthrough and an example where I took that risk to step out of my comfort zone. I've been trying lately to sort of break out of the mold of being labeled as a photorealist. I don't like that label. I'm trying to take my work as being to a place where it's something more than a mere copy of a photograph. And this work is called In My Absence, and it's the first work where I push my own boundaries a little. Oh, thank you so much. I actually... Thanks, Steph. I actually discovered the headless portrait photos from the Victorian era after I painted this painting. That was very freaky when I discovered those other portraits, in case you were wondering if I was referencing that. But so how it happened is that I took this photo I often do like a photo shoot if I get an idea, and I have several photos, and I had this one which I really wanted to paint because I loved the gesture of the hands and just the whole feeling, the mood of the picture, but the neck and the head was sort of at a very weird angle. So my husband actually suggested that, well, just don't paint the head and the neck, just leave it out. And I was like, that really piqued my curiosity because it's something totally out of what I would normally do. And I wondered what that would result in. So I took that chance, I took the risk, and I left out the head and the neck. And when I was painting this, it felt sort of like an out-of-body experience because it was so far removed from what I would normally do. I had pushed my brain, my reasoning and my logic aside, and I was instead working from a place of curiosity. And it went to the art fair in Stockholm, and it was the first work to sell. So it's really rewarding when you can step out of that comfort zone. My second observation is that curiosity fosters progress. I would like to illustrate this point by sharing an example of you or a story of you of a particularly transformative experience on my creative journey. A few months ago, I went through a really tough period in my art making process. Any creative person might know that it really goes like this, but that was a particularly low point for me. I felt stagnant, like I felt unmotivated, like my work just didn't excite me, and I experienced a general loss in creativity. I had no real drive to get up in the morning, go sit in front of the easel and paint for several hours. And I came to the realization that somewhere along the line I had stopped being curious. I had been focusing so much on establishing, like making a career out of art and like the business side of it, which I'm really bad at. But I sort of thought, oh, maybe I should produce work that would sell. I started harboring doubts and like doubting my abilities, questioning if I can really do this. And I forgot why it was and what it was that I fell in love with in the first place. My work did not excite me. And it obviously did not excite the art market either because art sales were slow, non-existent to be precise. But to cut a long, sad story of lots of sulking and brooding short, I reached a point where I refused to let it continue like that. And I made a conscious decision to reignite my curiosity. The evolution of my work was imminent. Determined to turn things around, I started doing what comes natural to me, and that is research. I started listening to podcasts, looking at other contemporary artists and at the old masters. I started reading up on philosophy and psychology around the human condition. I became attentive to my own spiritual and psychological state. And as a result of nurturing my curiosity, I could feel my creativity starting to return. In hindsight, I can say with all honesty that if it weren't for this enlightening experience, my art would not have evolved and still continue to evolve and mature. I strongly believe that curiosity is the vehicle we use to expand ourselves, to stretch ourselves, and to grow and to progress. As a creative, I know that one of my worst enemies is stagnation. And in allowing myself to be curious, I can prevent this by building upon and developing the content of my work. For example, I've always avoided a narrative in my work. And I wanted to leave most of the interpretation up to the viewer. But I think this was out of maybe fear and insecurity and not wanting to prescribe too much how a work should be read. And although now I still want to leave some room for interpretation or some room for guessing, I'm starting to slowly but surely assert myself, to raise my artistic voice, so to speak. So I've started to introduce objects into my work that carries personal symbolism for me. Though I don't necessarily expect the viewer to understand or to know this symbolism, I feel that it adds richness to the work, and I connect with the work on a personal level. One could almost say that the work is becoming a bit autobiographical. I've always had an interest, or one could say curiosity, about patterns, vintage or old objects, textiles and texture. And it was only recently that I decided to take the leap and introduce it into my work. Yeah, I found the dress at a vintage shop, and I just really liked the old lace, and yeah, so that's where that came from, the offering. This is a recent work I did where I started to experiment with using a palette knife instead of just only a brush. I used to always have very smooth surfaces because I try to avoid brush strokes or that they should not be visible. But with this one, I wanted to create texture. So I started using a palette knife. And I tried to be a bit more loose in my brush strokes and more generous in my application of paint to create a richer painted surface. I also included an animal, which for me is completely out of ordinary. I've never painted animals before, but the sparrows carries a personal symbolism for me. And it was actually quite liberating. I might do it again. In my case, and perhaps you can identify with this, it is not only necessary to discover new information in order to grow, but also to constantly remind myself what I started being curious about in the first place and why. And this brings me to my third observation. We should cultivate a habit of curiosity. I've always had a fascination with human skin. Some might call it morbid or a fetish or an obsession, but I could spend every day for the rest of my life exploring human skin as a subject. This thin, nearly translucent, multiple-layered organ that holds and envelops a human being is visually interesting and visually pleasing, as well as conceptually loaded. And aside from its obvious racial connotations, it carries a lot of other ideologies revolving around identity. Not only is skin for me the biggest challenge to recreate on a painted surface in such a way that it does it justice, but to me bare skin symbolizes the vulnerability and the fragility of the human condition. I'm interested in the human psyche, in vulnerability and the courage that it takes to be vulnerable. Skin being the complex film that covers a bone structure and blood vessels and that consists of multiple layers is seen as something that imitates, in a way, our human experience. With each layer, the previous layer is just a little bit visible still. Exploring these interests is ultimately what fuels my personal creative process. But when I get caught up in the mundanities of everyday life, I tend to neglect this. And over time, I forget. And one day I will find myself sitting in front of the easel and wondering what it is I'm doing and why. I think every creative person can relate when I say that creativity is so often very elusive. I often get stuck when I'm overwhelmed with anxiety and fear and frustration when something is just not working and I don't feel inspired at all. Actually, I hate using this term inspiration because to me, that implies an external force that is required in order for art to be made. But instead, I choose to rely on something a bit more consistent, a bit more within reach, and a bit dependable, and that is curiosity. I have to remind myself every day of the things that excite me and fascinate me. the things that make me want to ask questions, that makes me want to investigate and dig deeper and experiment. And never should I accept anything at face value. One of the most valuable lessons that I learned while studying art at university in Stellenbosch in South Africa is that we should always question everything. I remember being in several crit sessions with my lecturers, and they would ask, oh, so why did you do that? Why did you choose to use that material? And I would be like, I don't know, because I liked it, I don't know. And even though it seemed like it was really frustrating at the time, it was a really steep learning curve, it was such a good lesson to learn, because it forced us to really think about things, to really question our actions and our choices when it comes to art making. So I strive to live by the belief that in order to live a curiosity-driven life, I must commit to being constantly attentive to what piques my curiosity. Every day, it should become a discipline. I'd like to think of curiosity as a skill that needs to be cultivated, to learn to acknowledge, respect, and embrace curiosity. The reward will be immeasurable. I'd like to leave you with this quote by Gene Youngblood. I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing his name right, but anyway. An interested person is an interesting person. And I think we would all like to be characterized as interesting people. I know I sure would. So now go out and be curious. Thank you.